Erev Tov, everyone. Wonderful to be back and learning Torah. Before we get into tonight's topic, which in some ways is connected to the one we did a few weeks ago about what one should have in mind when they're praying in general, this is a much more specific topic, but in some ways it's quite connected. But the way that I'll jump into it is by talking about scientific experiments. Let's say that you're trying to prove that the moon is made of cheese. So you send a Mars rover over there and it comes back with some cheese. Now, I know this sounds absurd, but you come back and it brings back cheese. You say, oh, well, the moon's made of cheese. But what you have to do in scientific experiments, and the scientists here can correct me, is you also have to control for different factors and think, well, either the moon is made of cheese or my Mars rover happened to go by an old landing site where there were astronauts and they left out some cheese. I have to think about all the different factors in play before I make an assumption about my scientific experiment. So as absurd as that was, I don't know why I chose that. Maybe I just want some cheese. The reality is that we often make that mistake when we talk about what makes it challenging for people to connect to prayer. So someone might go into services and say the reason that people can't connect to prayer is because, and the list is, they don't believe in God. It's boring. They don't like the melodies. The list is many, many, many. But one of the most common things I hear, and there's a lot of truth to it, is that it's very hard for people to connect to prayer when it's in a language they either don't speak, can't read, pronounce, or certainly don't understand. So once you control for all the different factors about what makes it challenging for people to connect to prayer, you'll be the rabbi that makes $1 billion a year, and you'll have solved the issue that rabbis have been struggling with, as you'll see in these sources, for well over 1,000 years. But controlling for that, tonight we're going to focus specifically on the issue of people who can't connect because of the language. And again, there's many other challenges towards connecting to prayer, but this is a very common one. Somebody can't read Hebrew, or they can read Hebrew, but they have no idea what they're saying, and that's important. And to quickly summarize, last class we had about having a fixed text. The rabbi said, here's the fixed text, which is really the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the 18, now 19 blessings. One was added historically later. We have to say that. And once you say the same thing over and over again, it becomes rote. But at the same time, you can't let it become rote. It has to be fresh and inspiring, and you have to have full intention and understand the text. So with that as the background about it's not enough to just recite the text blindly, you would think that the easy solution would be, if you don't understand it, read it in translation. Well, is that okay? So the way we're going to do it tonight is we're going to look at basically two sections. The first section will look at the most classic sources that discuss this, and the Mishnah actually is where it begins, so 220 of the Common Era. And then we'll look at the way it's basically ruled, like the practical rulings, and then a few different opinions on a specific issue about even if it's permitted to pray in the vernacular, whether that's French, Hungarian, Czech, is it still ideal for one to learn Hebrew? And then the final section, which I think is very, very important, is this debate does not exist in a vacuum. It is not simply a matter of whether or not it's permitted to pray in your vernacular. It's also a matter of how the rabbis dealt with historical realities and some of the tensions between denominations, because we know different groups of Jews who said, it's important to understand what you're saying, so we'll translate it. And the Orthodox response to that in some ways ignored or distorted or really just let their own biases, they wore it on their shoulders. So Alina, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this first text here, out of context, it just doesn't, it doesn't seem so exciting, but it's pretty straightforward. And it starts out, these are the texts that you can say in any language. It doesn't originally there in Hebrew, but you can say them in any language. And I'm not necessarily going to explain what every single one of them is, but I will mention one or two because it'll get to the underlying reason of why the rabbis felt it was important that these specific texts should be in a language that someone understands. So go ahead, Alina, please. Source number one. It says it's from the Talmud, but it's actually originally from the earlier text of the Mishnah. But this is the page of the Talmud it appears on. Please.
Okay, 1 second. Mom, can you give them the soup, please?
That's not part of the text.
No, I made my neighbor some soup.
Oh, that's so sweet of you. Excellent. A nice mitzvah. All right, go ahead. These are recited.
Okay. So just the first one?
Yeah, source number 1. These are recited in any language. I'm going to make the
Okay.
text a little bigger.
Okay, these are recited in any language, not specifically Hebrew.
That's on a phone call or something.
The point. You're welcome. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
The portion of the warning and the oath administered by the priest to a woman suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful, sota,
I'll
and the
explain that.
direct.
That's important. Yeah, keep going.
Okay, and the declaration of tithes, which occurs after the 3rd and 6th years of the 7th year sabbatical cycle, when one declares that he has given his tithes appropriately, Shema and the Amidah prayer, and grace after meals and an oath of testimony, where one takes an oath that he does not have any testimony to provide on a given issue, and an oath on a deposit, where one takes an oath that he does not have possession of another's deposit.
Excellent. So this, it looks like it's pretty much absolutely everything that you can say. Certainly the core text, the Shema, Yisrael. So I can go, and we'll see that later. I can go, "Hear Yisrael, our Lord, our God." And, there's different translations of it. We have it in our Siddur, in the Amidah, which is, again, like for the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, that was prayer. Our Siddurim that are this thick, that was not the Siddur they had. They had many Psalms, Tehillim, that they would include here and there on special occasions. But again, their prayer service was basically the Shema and the Amidah. The Sota section is interesting. That's a very challenging mitzvah from the Torah, where the power is very much on the husband, where if he thinks his wife is committing adultery, and again, before you even get to that, the tensions in their marriage, the collapse of their marriage are very, apparent there, but he can accuse his wife, and she has to go through this painful, awful ceremony to prove her innocence. And if she's guilty, she dies. And if she's innocent, she becomes pregnant. But you ask, why would she want to become pregnant with this husband who's accused her? However, the reason I point that out, besides that it's a fascinating and challenging topic, is if one is going to accuse a person of doing something, it's very important that they understand what they're being accused of. The Shema is the central tenet of our faith. It is the foundational line about what we believe. If one is going to recite the foundation of faith, it's important that one understands what they're saying. And that's kind of we'll see this come out in some of the later texts, but that's kind of the thing that ties these together. Some of them you have to dig a little bit deeper. Where does that fit in? But in general, the reason that these formulas that were written in Hebrew when people used to speak Hebrew can now be said in any other language is because they're not just a ritual text. So there's a debate that goes on, and I didn't bring everything, about certain texts like the Megillot, like the stories of Purim, about whether that should be in the original Hebrew, because maybe it doesn't matter if people understand it as long as it's being said word for word. I'm not going to tell you what the final rulings are because there's a lot more for me to look into, but that's the kind of question. If it's important to understand what you're saying, then you should be able to say it in any language. If it's everyone would agree it's ideal to understand it, but there's some text where it's just about reciting the text, at least communally, and it doesn't, like reading of the Torah publicly. It needs to be read publicly. It's not necessarily about an individual's understanding. So in general, I'm not familiar with any denomination or congregation where the text is read in the Hebrew, except for one semi-exception. There, Talmud talks about in certain towns, a person would read the Hebrew from the Torah, and then you'd have someone next to them, I think a maturgaman from the word Targum translation, who would translate it and kind of explain it as they went along. We don't have that today, but we have something akin to it. Every once in a while, between an aliyah, a rabbi, sometimes myself will explain it. But fundamentally, Torah just needs to be read. The understanding is secondary. But with these things, understanding is key because you want to have kavanah, intention. So the next section here is how the Talmud explores that question, and then it brings up something weird that we're not going to spend too much time with. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would read this short section from Sota, and by the way, what does it have to do with Sota, the accused woman? It's because the Mishnah talked about the Sota and how her text can be in any language. So that's the connection here, the contextual connection to why they're talking about saying the Amidah in any language. So please, Gloria, source number 2.
It is stated in the Mishnah that the Amidah prayer may be recited in any language. The reason for this is that since prayer is a request for divine mercy, one may pray in any way that one desires. The Gemara asks, but may prayer really be recited in any language? But didn't Rav Yehuda say a person should never request in the Aramaic language that his needs be met? As Rabbi Yochanan said, that with regard to anyone who requests in the Aramaic language that his needs be met, the ministering angels do not attend to him, as the ministering angels are not familiar with the Aramaic language.
The word here in Hebrew is, as opposed to K-N-O-W, to know something, you don't say in Hebrew, I know a word. You say, I'm familiar with the word. Ani makir, I know the word for, dog or whatever it is, like that. Please continue.
The Gemara answers, this is not difficult, as that statement of Rabbi Yochanan is referring to the prayer of an individual who needs the support of the angels, whereas this statement of the Mishnah is referring to communal prayer.
Excellent. So I'm going to compartmentalize this Talmudic section and mention something that I cut out. So the basic takeaway is that one can do the Amidah in pretty much any prayer in any language. Now, why do they go on this weird tangent about Aramaic language? Historically, the Aramaic language was adopted by the people because that's where they were living. And the reason some of the prayers, like the Kaddish, Yitkadal v'Yitkadash, may God be made great, etc., like that, was in Aramaic, is because they, it was the vernacular, and they wanted people to have some prayers they could have access to. Now, obviously, they didn't translate everything into Aramaic. If you go back to the times when the Kaddish was written, while that is in Aramaic and a few other prayers are in Aramaic, the rest are still in Hebrew. So there's some mystery about all of the decisions, and again, more research could be done. However, if that's true, that Aramaic was adopted simply because it's the vernacular, gives people access to the question, what's the problem? The Mishnah says you can daven in any language. So why is Aramaic different? And this is where there's no clear answer. The section I didn't include here from the Talmud goes on this fascinating tangent about a king in the Tanakh who asked for help, and the voice of God that came out and gave him guidance was in Aramaic, so clearly Aramaic must be fine. It gets pretty wild, but some of the hypotheses that I've seen is that Aramaic takes on a different status, and Aramaic, is a language that's the angels either do understand or don't understand. And basically, if a congregation is praying in Aramaic, maybe it implies that they're asking not God for help, but the angels. But the reason that answer kind of falls flat is because does that mean that God doesn't know Aramaic? So it gets very, very confusing. But the reason it's important to bring here, again, there's no good answer I found as to why Aramaic is a problem. But the practical law is reflected in that there's a difference between praying individually and communally with certain Aramaic prayers. For example, if there's no minyan, if there's not a quorum to say prayers, we don't say the Kaddish. There's, for those familiar, on Saturday morning after the Torah service, there are these 3 paragraphs starting with Yakum Purkan. And one of them is praying for scholars, and one is for the community, and they're written in Aramaic, or at least 2 of them are, but you only say the first one unless you have a minyan. And that is reflective of this discussion here, which we'll see in a moment in the Shulchan Aruch, is that there is, when someone's praying alone, don't pray in Aramaic, because again, it might be that one is, implying that they're going to the angels and not God. Again, there's no good answer for it, but it is reflected in the law, in the ruling. So before we go on to the ruling about how this all plays out, because this is pretty much it. There's more here, but that's the basic. These are the basic sources. Any questions up until now? Oh, we lost Goy and Leonard. Hopefully they'll come back. Excellent. And people who are on mute and I can't see their punams, their lovely punams, go ahead and you can send a chat, or I think you can unmute yourselves. So the next thing here, very straightforward, is the ruling. So Alina, I'm actually going to unmute you again. And this goes a little on the next page, but the Shulchan Aruch, which is again 1563. Welcome back, Lori and Leonard. So the Shulchan Aruch 1563, co-written by Rav Yosef Cairo, Sephardic rabbi, and then amended and added on to by Rav, why am I blanking on it right now? Rabbi Moshe Isserles. So this is probably from Rav Yosef Cairo. So go ahead, Alina, please. One may pray in.
Okay. One may pray in any language one desires, and this applies when one is praying together with a congregation. But when one is praying alone, one should only pray in the holy language, And some say that this requirement to only pray in Hebrew only applies when one is asking for one's own personal needs. For example, one who has prayed for someone who is ill or for some affliction in one's household. However, when reciting the regular liturgy established for the congregation, even an individual may recite it in any language. And some say that even an individual requesting his own personal needs may request them in any language one wishes, except for in the Aramaic language.
Excellent. So I'm going to go back to the previous Talmud for a second. So there's that line there. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, that last thing. The Gemara answers. This is not difficult, as that statement of Rabbi Yochanan about whether Aramaic is permitted is referring to the prayer of an individual who needs support of the angels, whereas this statement of the Mishnah is referring to communal prayer. So that's still reflected here, a distinction between communal and private prayer. So he basically rules, not right out of the Talmud, but from other sources and early rabbis. But he basically rules what the Talmud says is that any language is okay communally across the board. When one is praying alone, not ideally, one must pray in Hebrew. However, he adds on that praying alone, there's exceptions to it. One praying alone can say any of the main prayers like the Amidah, the Shema, in any language. So what does it mean by the communal prayers? You would have to look deeper into specific things there. And then there's a distinction about if somebody is praying for themselves versus for someone else. And then at the end, he finally says, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. Many people say that some say, and there are cues and keywords in the Shulchan Aruch about whether he likes an opinion, whether it's the preferred opinion, or whether he's just listing it and he says, ideally, don't do that. We're not going to look into that now. But the fact is, he recognizes and accepts that it's valid to pray in any language individually except for Aramaic. So there's still something fundamentally problematic about Aramaic. And again, there's no good answer for it. Now, we could look more into it, and the ones I saw, again, had to do more with the angels, et cetera, like that. But fundamentally speaking, that's not our issue. Our question is, Rabbi, can I pray out of a French siddur without any of the Hebrew? And the answer is yes. Can I pray out of a Chinese siddur? The answer is yes. Now, a question I did see is, what if somebody's praying in a Czech, which is a phonetic language? Well, it's not a good example because I have some odd letters, but let's say someone's reading in a phonetic language that they don't speak. Spanish, that's a good one. I'm reading the prayers, I'm reading the Amidah in Spanish, but I don't speak Spanish. I know a handful of words. Does that count? And that's a very interesting question. The answers I saw seem to imply that it wouldn't, but technically speaking, any language means any language. But the reason you can do any language, as again we'll see in some later sources, and I mentioned, is so you can understand what you're saying. But this is the fundamental ruling. Other than Aramaic, which is funny, and it's again reflected in our services. If there's not a minyan, and when we get to Yakum Porkan, we skip some of the paragraphs, and we don't do Kaddish. There's no Aramaic stuff without a minyan. So Aramaic is a funny story. And one other really important thing here that'll come up later, Gloria, if you'll take this short source number 2, please. I don't know if it's earlier or later. It's earlier in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's very relevant to if somebody says, okay, Rabbi, you said I can daven in French. Is there anything I should know when I'm looking for a good French siddur? And the answer is, go ahead, Gloria, source number 2.
It disappeared. I can hear you, but I don't see anything.
Oh, no worries. I'll just read the source. So he says, one may read the Shema in any language. So he's emphasizing that, even though this is earlier in the Shulchan Aruch. But one should be careful to avoid word mispronunciations. They should make a mistake in the letters and the way it's pronounced in this language. And one should be precise in it, just as in Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue. So if somebody says, you know what, I'm just gonna, get like a easy, like sloppy translation. You know what, this is a good example. If someone's gonna take the Siddur and go to Google Translate and copy and paste it in, that is not acceptable according to the Shulchan Aruch. Yes, it might be a loose translation, and a lot of it may be accurate in some of the words, but it's probably going to be a pretty bad translation. And we'll see that actually come up shortly in a moment. So if somebody wants to read in English is probably the most common one, but there are Russian, there's Siddurim in translation all over the world. It has to be a good translation. Now, in most cases, if someone's going to pray in another language, I think it's pretty accessible. I'm sure there's a good Chinese translation. There's certainly good English translations. That's not the issue. But now that we found the basic ruling, which is pretty explicitly clear that it's fine, with that weird exception of Aramaic, it's fine to daven in any language. And while they haven't explicitly said what's the underlying reason behind it, behind the, we can kind of get the between the lines that it's about understanding. The next question is, all right, so I can pray in French. Do I even need to bother to learn Hebrew? So before I even go into the next section, what do you, Gloria and Leonard, you're unmuted. What do you think? Is it even worth it to learn Hebrew if somebody's a very good French speaker?
I think it's worth it.
Okay, why do you, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but why do you think Hebrew is important?
Well, for example, in our synagogue, I don't understand everything, all the prayers in Hebrew, but at least I know where we are, so I can sort of follow the Hebrew, but read along in the English at the same time and know what's going on.
Yeah, so it's not even just about understanding, it's about being familiar with the tongue and being able to be part of the community, because there's a distinction here, and Jane, I do see your hand up. There's a distinction here between an individual praying, which is fine, certainly during COVID, but also a community. So excellent. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And go ahead, please.
I'm really surprised by the ruling because it's not what we do. I mean, we always conduct our services, particularly in the Orthodox, where we conduct them completely in Hebrew.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling like you're going to get to something else in the later parts.
So 100%.
The advantage of staying with the Hebrew is that I can go into a Czech synagogue, or I can go into, a Moldovan synagogue, and I can find my place immediately.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about that is that's been true for me when I lived in Prague for half a year, and I traveled to, Poland and Hungary and everything. And I went to different synagogues, and when they did the main services, I had no problem following along. But the Divrei Torah, the sermons were in the vernacular, and there, whether it was German or Hungarian, there was a little bit lost. And I'm going to be in Israel in a couple of weeks, and it'll be exciting for me to see if I can follow along with their Divrei Torah. But the tefillot are meant to be universal. And I had a rabbi from camp many years ago, and he said his goal at this camp was to make sure that every single camper could go into any shul in the world and pick up a siddur and participate in the services. Now, that's a lofty goal. Whether or not that 100% successful, it's a beautiful goal. And we're going to see basically two things. One is a preference thing, which is fair. And I think that might reflect some of the things we said. But the last one, again, is really about a historical, political component of it. And I think that'll really speak, Jane, to why Orthodoxy is so opposed to doing things in translation. Even though there's some things we do, like the prayer for the state of Israel and the United States, we read in Hebrew, but we also translate it, partly because our country, the US, speaks English. But there's something unique and powerful about that moment and us connecting with our greater country, and we want to understand what we're doing. So I think that's a really, really good point in question. So this next section here talks about, does it matter if you do it in Hebrew? Does it really matter if you just stick to your lingua franca? So Lena, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So the Tosafot is not one person. So we're talking about, 10th, 11th, 12th century around France and Germany. These are a series of schools, Ashkenazi Jews, and the founders of the schools were pretty much all the grandchildren of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. So they studied in a style, and their commentaries on the Talmud are one side is Rashi, and the other side are the academies that were founded by his grandsons, which is really cool. There's a lot of differences, but they're very important for Ashkenazi Jews figuring out law. So I put a little title here so you know what the point of it is, which is what I kept mentioning is what's more important, doing it in Hebrew or understanding what you're saying. So go ahead, Alina, please. Source number 1, Tosafot on Sota 32a.
This means in any language that he understands, to preclude a Median who may not read it in Persian if he does not understand it. But the text Bechol Lashon,
which means in any
implies
language,
whether one understands it or not, though the Gemara on Amud Beis does not seem to say that.
Excellent. So first of all, he's recognizing what Tosafot often does. So Rashi, when he reads a page of the Talmud, he just wants to understand that page. He knows the whole Talmud, but he focuses on the individual page and what is the page saying. Tosafot says, this page is in conversation with this page 7,000 pages away, or not that many, but they take every single time this conversation comes up and they smash them against each other and try and find a resolution, especially when they disagree with each other. But the first thing he says is the Talmud, or the Mishnah really says, Bechol Lashon, in any language. So I don't speak Japanese, but technically, according to that, I could say it in Japanese. But what he comes to say is that no. The key here is understanding. So I am not, according to Tosafot, I would not be permitted to read it in Spanish or pray in Spanish, pray in Russian, etc., like that. Now, he does mention that the actual words Bechol Lashon, in any language, technically mean in any language, but then he goes on to say, but the next page of the Gemara disagrees with that. The important takeaway here is that most people understand Tosafot as saying that you can say it in any language you want as long as you understand it, and there's no specific preference for Hebrew. The preference is that you understand what's going on. So if you're an Israeli, and we have several Israelis in our congregation, then of course Hebrew is your preferred language. But if you're not fluent in Hebrew, it's more important that you know what you're saying to God. When you're in conversation with God, it's better to speak in English. And that goes back to Jane's comment about, I'm kind of surprised about this ruling. If this is really the most important thing, why don't we do it in translation? So the next one here, and these are not hard and fast ruling, that's important. This is about preference. So Tosafot said it doesn't really matter as long as you understand it. But later in the 19th, 20th century, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, in his work, the Mishnah Berurah, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, Gloria, this is what he has to say, and he, has a slightly different understanding of Bechol Lashon, in any language. Please.
In any language. Specifically, this refers to a language one understands. This is the ruling for Tefillah, Birkat HaMazon, Kiddush, and the blessings over mitzvot and fruits, as well as Hallel, according to the strict letter of the letter.
Oh, sorry, strict letter of the law.
Yeah, according to the strict letter of the law, this is all fine. But ideally, one should say all these things in Hebrew, because there are words in Hebrew that we don't know how to translate as well.
Excellent. So this is very important. You have to, read what he's saying, which again echoes the Tosafot. That phrase Bechol Lashon, he adds the exception or the specific point that it's not, you can't say it in Chinese if you don't speak Chinese. It needs to be a language you understand. And then he has the whole list. You can say all of these tefillot. Again, there's a little bit of a debate about certain texts that always need to be in Hebrew. I think it's around the Megillot, but generally, for the most part, everything we say. And then there's some interesting things about certain before and after blessings, etc. But pretty much, more or less, everything that we say, all of our main tefillot and prayers, can be said in any language that we speak and understand. But he goes on and he says, that's true. And that's important. If somebody says, Rabbi, according to the law, can I pray in French? The answer is yes. Is it better if I pray in Hebrew? Tosafot says, all that matters is you understand what you're saying. Mishnah Berurah, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, the Chafetz Chaim is another nickname for him from another work he wrote, says it's better to do it in Hebrew. Why? So there's a lot of different answers building off what he says here. But what he specifically says is there are words in Hebrew that are really difficult to translate. The example he brings from the paragraph of the Shema, the Ve'ahavta, is Veshinantam, which maybe it's like to teach them or something like that. But again, and then he has a whole long conversation about how to translate, etc. And Rashi makes a big deal about translating words in the Torah into Old French. But the reason he needs to do that is because there are a lot of words in the Torah and our liturgy that don't translate so well, whether it's hard to find a literal translation or there's a concept, and there are plenty of languages. Anyone here who's seriously studied another language probably knows words that don't translate well to other languages, whether it's to English, which I think we all have in common. I hope so. Otherwise, you have no idea what I'm saying. But Hebrew, too, has its idioms that don't work well in other languages. So it's very important. The Mishnah Berurah still says it's totally permitted. He's explicit about that. But it's better to do it in the Hebrew because the translations are never as good. So Jane, to your question, that's not a very like a knockout punch against praying in the vernacular, but you're starting to get into why Hebrew might be important. And many people will quote the Mishnah Brura as the source for why Hebrew is okay. Not what he says. He says it's better. It's I think he says like mina muvchar. It's like the ideal way to do it, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. But interestingly enough, if we actually go back in time now, because the Mishnah Brura is referencing earlier sources, but if we go to the 12th century Germany, this work by a man named Yehuda HeChasid, probably not his last name, Yehuda the Righteous, this work Sefer Hasidim, and it's a specific historical moment for Ashkenazi Jews who are basically extremely pious. You know, these would be like the breakaway groups that want nothing to do with society and they just want to live a life of holiness. Not monks per se, not like living up on the mountain, but they're very, very pious. And this is a work where he goes through laws and customs relevant to that community. And he's aware of this tension between understanding on the one hand and the beauty and power of Hebrew. So Gloria, I'll just have you take this one text and then I'll do the final source to the end. So in the Sefer HaChasidim, he tries to find a kind of little balance between those two realities of it's important to understand, but Hebrew is also great. Please, Gloria.
It is better for a person to pray and recite Shema and Brachot in a language that he comprehends, rather than pray in Hebrew and not understand. Or it is this reason that the Talmud, both in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael, was written in Aramaic, so that even the unlettered can understand the mitzvot.
Excellent. So what he says here, and there's actually a little source after it. I guess I didn't include it. I did not include it. So I think it's right before this, where he says clearly it's more important to understand rather than to pray in Hebrew and not understand. And he says the Talmud wasn't written in Hebrew, it was written in a language that everyone could comprehend. But then he goes on to say, I really should have just brought the other source. In the other source, he says, but what you really should do is just learn Hebrew and understand Hebrew, because there's so much beauty in that language. It connects us. And again, the last sources I think will really kind of emphasize why Hebrew is so important. But this kind of goes back again to our previous class, where the tension was you have to pray the same prayers, but they have to be inspiring and meaningful. And both of those things have to be true. So what do? You spend time studying them. You meditate before you go into the prayer. You find other ways to add meaning to the rote prayers so that you can still do the same prayers, but you can still have that meaning, which is challenging to do that. And what he says here is more important to understand it than to do in Hebrew, but Hebrew is also great. So what do? Learn Hebrew. And that's challenging. And it doesn't just mean being able to read it. It means being able to understand it. And that's a lot of work. It's a lifetime of work. And there's some incredible sidurim that really try and make this accessible by having, we have them at our synagogue, actually. It has every single word of the sidur, for Shabbat at least, and the Yomei Tov, in the Hebrew letters, transliterated and then translated. So you can, obviously it's a very much slower way of praying, but that's not bad. We all pray, including myself, much too quickly. But to be able to look word for word and internalize the meaning while still praying in Hebrew, even in the transliteration, that's a beautiful tool. And I wish there were actually more sidurim that did that, that weren't specifically for one publishing company and one kind of pronunciation. But it's still an amazing tool. And I'm glad our synagogue invested in buying like at least 20 copies of it. But again, Hebrew is beautiful and important, but it's just as important, if not more important, to understand. So the Sefer HaChasidim, again, he brought in another source. I don't know why I didn't include it, where he says just learn Hebrew and then you have the best of both worlds. So before I go through the final section, any final thoughts? Not final, any thoughts, comments, or questions up until now? Beautiful. All right, excellent. So this next section is from an article by Rabbi David Brofsky. Hello, Rifty. Wonderful to see you. Welcome. And a lot of books on my shelf are from him. He's just a really incredible rabbi. And I think I've said in the past, one of the things I love about him is his intellectual honesty. But when he brings a question about whether it's the laws of mourning, the laws of kashrut, he doesn't just say, the Shulchan Aruch says it's permitted, here's my ruling. He'll explain how it got from the earliest sources available, whether it's the Talmud or the Torah, and explain how it went through and what are the debates. Why did the medieval rabbis debate on it? What does that mean today? Now, obviously, it takes longer to get through it that way, but that kind of learning is so valuable, and we take it for granted. So his books, which are many in English and often available online for free, are amazing. So in this article, which he's actually continuing on a conversation about, I think, the Keva and Kavanah, fixed rote prayer and intention, etc., talks about vernacular. And he jumps in by talking about the history, because Aramaic was, again, very much a response to people speaking a new language and no longer being Hebrew speakers. But the conversation, and then Yiddish would be the same thing. There are prayers and songs and things in Yiddish. At Havdalah, there's a paragraph said, Gott von Avraham, God of Abraham. So Yiddish they had no problem with. So why is it when German, people wanted to daven in German, which again is very similar to Yiddish, why was that a problem all of a sudden? And I think you can kind of guess. So he starts, or this is actually in the middle of his article. In the first half of the 18th century in Germany, the early reform movement, it's always about the political battles between denominations and not wanting to validate the others, even when their point is totally valid. So the early reform movement introduced numerous changes to Jewish ritual. Aside from introducing an organ into the synagogue on Shabbat and abridging and at times excising large portions of the liturgy, they also replaced parts of the traditional Jewish Siddur with a German translation. These early reformers established synagogues in central German cities such as Berlin and Hamburg. Now, we're not going to go into each of those things. The organ, there's actually arguments, which I don't believe are correct, but there are arguments for why it might potentially be permitted on Shabbat, and they're not crazy arguments. So saying that that's absolutely verboten and a sin, not totally, even though I would never permit it and most wouldn't. What about removing certain sections of the text? We do it. There are lots of sections that many Orthodox shuls, like the poems, etc., like that, the text is changed all the time by very Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox group. So that's clearly not so problematic. And as we just learned, even though there's a preference for Hebrew, perhaps a strong one, there's nothing wrong with the vernacular. Obviously, something else is going on here. So continues, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, and he gives the dates there, one of the leading rabbis of European Jewry in the first half of the 19th century, strongly opposed these reforms. And these rabbis, brilliant men, but when you got them talking about the reform movement, you wouldn't even want to hear it. You'd be like, that's like Lashon Hara. How can you talk about other Jews that way? Now, for them, they thought that the reform movement was a fundamental threat to all of Judaism. That's for another class. And I don't personally see it that way at all, but I understand where these rabbis are coming from, even though their rulings are quite, there's a lot of vitriol, a lot of negative feeling behind it. And you'll see that come out. In his well-known collection of responsa called the Chatam Sofer, the seal of the scribe, his last name Sofer, he was asked by a local rabbi, in order to stem the influence of the reformers, to issue a letter, meaning this rabbi said, can you put out a letter to slow down the reformers and stop them, prohibiting the use of an organ in synagogue on Shabbat, the abridgment of the prayers, as well as reciting tefillot in German. So here is a translation. Even though tefillah may be recited in any language, he admits that, this refers to a temporary situation. There might be a source out there that says it. I haven't seen anything that specifically, and again, that doesn't mean there's not, but we saw the fundamental sources, and they didn't talk about temporary. They said, B'chol lashon. You can do it in anything. The Mishnah Brura says you can do it in anything, even if there's a preference. Temporary, not sure where he gets from. And again, he may be quoting a rabbi I'm just not familiar with. So I'm very much open to that. I'm just not familiar with him quoting someone else. However, to do so permanently and to appoint a shaliach tzibur, the person leading the service is a chazan, to always pray in the vernacular is prohibited. If so, the members of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which is like the great council of rabbis, who, so this going back to the Second Temple, and supposedly included Mordechai from the story of Esther. And these are the great scholars that history tells us wrote the Siddur, and they probably did indeed put together the Amidah, because again, the Siddur was developed much later through medieval times and the Crusades, etc. But the Amidah was probably written in the Second Temple era by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who established the tefillot in the pure and holy tongue. They didn't write them in Aramaic. They should have written the prayers in Persian, as that was the common language in the time of Ezra. So indeed, there clearly is some value that the Second Temple rabbis had of Hebrew. That's not crazy, but that doesn't mean that that negates the permission to pray in other languages. And he also brings Rav Yisrael Lifshitz, in his commentary in the Mishnah, Tiferet Yisrael, which is a great commentary, who writes, however, in our days, those who love innovation have arisen, and they want to prove from our Mishnah that they may pray in their synagogues in German. We are embarrassed by their new ways, as their primary intention is to make us similar to those who we cannot become similar to. This is, Rabbi Brovsky's edition, the Christians. And even if this wouldn't be prohibited by the injunction, and you shall not follow in their paths, there's a mitzvah in the Torah, lo bechukotehem, do not follow in their ways. So idolatry, dressing in idolatrous things, listening to idolatrous music. And he says, even if praying in Persian or English isn't technically an idolatrous practice, it continues on, since the majority of Torah scholars are opposed, the Torah commands us in the prohibition of lo tasur, to listen to their voice. Lo tasur is in the Torah, and it says, do not turn away from the commands of the elders, which is kind of the basis for authority for myself today. If you say, is there any mitzvah in the Torah that says we have to listen to rabbis? That's it. But again, read between the lines here. He is not hiding his feelings for the reformers. They are trying to turn us into the Christians. And by the way, if you go to Hungary and the Doheny synagogue on Doheny Street, and you walk inside, it's this massive, beautiful, gorgeous synagogue, but on the side, there's these little round staircases. And the Jews never used them. What were they there for? The person who designed their synagogue designed Catholic churches and included those little stairs, because I don't know all the details of it, but the priest, whether they would give their sermons or blessings, etc., someone can correct me later on that, but they were indeed just copying the Christians. And even here in America, the early Americans, the Spanish Portuguese to some extent, wanted to be like the country they were coming to, and they were influenced by and adopted things of their culture. And these rabbis were opposed to that, because instead of saying these things can enhance our Judaism and make it more accessible for people, they said it's going to turn us into Christians and idolaters. That hasn't been true. Assimilation is another conversation that has been devastating, but it's not because the rabbis translated sections of the Siddur. And he says in there, even though it's technically probably fine, most rabbis are against it, and we should listen to the rabbis. Now, that is not nothing. The reason that I, as an observant Jew, and thousands of other observant Jews, don't use electricity or turn electrical objects on and off is not because there's really a problem. It doesn't fit into any of the forbidden categories of Shabbat. So why don't we use electricity? Because many great rabbis before us felt that it should not be permitted on Shabbat. And that became the ruling. So this is a tension between technically what's permitted and the way that rabbis are ruling for their community. And again, this goes back to what you said, Jane, is not only is there clearly a political component here, but regardless of what's technically permitted, most of these big deal rabbis have said you got to do it in the Hebrew. That doesn't mean you can't have a translation on the page, but for publicly going out, blessed are you, oh God, the shield of, et cetera, like that, none of these rabbis would permit it. And because they've established that ruling and all these different rulings, it's hard to overturn that, even if you can say, but if you go back to the Shulchan Aruch, it says it's fine. The Mishnah Berurah says it's not ideal, but it's fine. There's nothing not nothing, but it's very hard to overturn that. I'll pause before I continue the section. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So it continues on. More recently, oh yeah, Jane. Just got to unmute and then go ahead. Yeah, please.
What I'm seeing is, as a result of the Enlightenment and emancipation, this is why this happened.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because vernacular has been a component of our prayers and our books and our, there's a famous work, Sena Urena, which is a book of stories on the Torah and the Midrash. That's written in Yiddish, and it's a holy sacred book, and many from publishing houses still print it now in the English, etc. So clearly it's not the vernacular that was the problem. It's I think what you're pointing out, it's the Enlightenment.
It was the fear of assimilation.
Yeah. And my point is that, yes, assimilation is something to be feared, and it's devastated not just the Jewish people, but many other peoples in different countries, whether an extreme example like France. America is interesting because I think it goes back and forth. This is beyond, you actually, Jane, are far more expert than I am in that, in the history of the states, but America has an interesting relationship with religion in general. But again, putting the Siddur in a way that it's accessible to people and inspires them to speak to God is not going to turn them into Christians and turn them away from God. This is, I think I talked in an earlier class about why the rabbis, it was a class about coffee. The rabbis had no issue with coffee being kosher. They had an issue with coffee houses. Why? Because they were deeply concerned with assimilation. And the only thing they could do is try and forbid going to coffee houses. So here, even though there's nothing wrong with the vernacular, they have to try and throw their weight around. And I'm not judging them. And I respect them. And in some ways, I probably do some things that, like, maybe technically we do it this way, but I'm thinking about the cohesion of our community, our relationship with the greater Milwaukee community. I'm like, we could be more lenient, but I think it's better for every, there's a lot of benefits by being more traditional, but that doesn't mean that it's not permitted to be more lenient. And that is a subjective policy decision. And as I learned in yeshiva, 99%, I'm exaggerating, 99% of rabbinic opinions and shuvot are more about policy than the ruling, because most of the time the rulings are fairly straightforward. Again, I'm exaggerating and oversimplifying, but you see that here. Excellent, thank you, Jane. So he continues on. More recently, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, known as the Three-Day Esh, author of the response Three-Day Esh, responded in 1954, so we're getting much more recent historically, to a question regarding introducing Psalms, translating in English into the service. Shouldn't be a problem. Firstly, he suggests that in the modern era, the only home of complete and pure Judaism is in the synagogue, and therefore one should insist that only Hebrew be used in the Beit Knesset. So if you said to him, can I go home and study, Jewish law, the laws of kashrut in English, maybe you'd have less of a problem with that. But the Hebrew language, if we're not going to have that anywhere in the synagogue, it's done. He suggests that prohibiting the use of foreign languages, will underscore the necessity of learning Hebrew, and that Hebrew prayer subconsciously strengthens the sense of kedusha, of sanctification, of specialness, of tefillah, and of the Beit Knesset. So he's supporting these other rulings, but he's doing it in a much more positive way. That I think Gloria and Leonard kind of reflects what you were getting at there about connecting to the community, rather than making it, we hate the reformers and where they're destroying Judaism and turning us into Christians and idolaters. It's rather, Hebrew is a beautiful thing, and it's a special language, and we don't want to lose that, because if we don't pray in Hebrew, we are going to lose it. And I think there's a value to that. And again, it doesn't mean that I agree that it should be forbidden, but I agree with the idea that it's worth, like the Sefer Hasidim, I think it's worth going out of our way to make Hebrew more accessible, rather than just say, pray in anything, let's bring back Hebrew, but again, make it more educational and more proactive. It continues. Secondly, he argues that maintaining the customs of old helps to preserve and sustain our religion. As Rashi comments on the verse, go out in the path of the sheep, Shirashirim, go out in the steps in the path that they walked in, meaning previous generations, examine the ways of your forefathers and walk in their path. Again, it's supporting the more strict ruling that was from a more negative biased place, but putting a very positive, beautiful spin. And the Three-Day Esh is considered by many a kind of modern Orthodox type rabbi, even though he tended to be fairly traditional. But this is a beautiful way. It connects you to tradition. Your great-great-great-grandfather, or maybe just your grandfather, or for some of you, yourselves or just your parents, prayed in Hebrew. And it's beautiful to know that they prayed in it, and so do you. Thirdly, and this is where he gets to the more assimilation-y, like the other rabbis. Thirdly, he invokes the slippery slope principle. Introducing some English passages to the service, he claims, may set a precedent to transform the entire tefillah to English. The slippery slope argument can be used for absolutely everything, and sometimes it is totally appropriate. Sometimes, most of the time, it's blown out of proportion. So again, he's very progressive, proactive, but he still throws in that we're worried about assimilation because it was a fear. Translating the prayer book isn't what led to assimilation exploding, but assimilation was and still is a clear and present danger. Rather, he suggests that those who have difficulty with Hebrew prayer should glance at the English translation in their Siddurim, but communal prayer should still be recited in Hebrew. So Gloria, that's validating what you do, and I'm sure many do. And that Siddur I mentioned that has Hebrew, transliteration, Hebrew, English letters, how it should be pronounced, and then the English is a godsend for this. And I really like his idea. Obviously, we should go beyond that. We should have Hebrew classes, et cetera, like that. And that's not every synagogue has those resources. But the Sefer Chasidim said it's important that you understand it, but Hebrew is also beautiful, so just work at it. Finally, and this is Rav Brodsky's, so this is very contemporary, his personal opinion. I would like to point out that the question of praying in the vernacular is just another example of a tension we have already seen between two aspects of tefillah. That's what I mentioned with our last class. We've noted in previous shiurim classes that prayer has a formal aspect. That's the keva, the fixed rote recitation, as the rabbis taught. Prayer is instead of the sacrifices. So you have 3 sacrifices a day, or 2 sacrifices, 2 set services, and everyday sacrifices, everyday praying. On the other hand, prayer was established by the Avot, the fathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Chana as well, was one of the mothers of what we consider prayer. Prayer is also spontaneous and intimate, as man bears his soul and women bear their souls to their creator. Seemingly, while a prayer said in Hebrew, which isn't understood, may be similar to the first type, the set rote recitation, prayer recited in the vernacular expresses the innermost thoughts of the mitpala, the one who is praying internally, reflectively, and may be recited in either language. So ultimately, he recognizes the ruling that it is permitted to pray in any language, but at the same time, he recognizes this tension in prayer. Prayer connects us to the past, and the way it does that is by having a set text that is generally unchanged throughout the generations, other than minor additions, but at the same time, that loses meaning. So if we pray in English, we'll get more meaning, but we'll lose the connection to the past. And of course, if we continue to pray in the original Hebrew, we're connected to the past, but we lose the meaning. And in either case, you lose people. And as I started out at the beginning of this, one of the questions is, why is it hard for people to connect to synagogue? And there is more than one answer, but this is a big one. And there's no one single answer for it, but the reality is there are a lot of great resources. Those Sidurim that have all of the languages in it, the fact that the English text is there, the fact that there are commentaries at the bottom. And I read one thing really nice. It said, if you don't have time to read the whole translation, a lot of paragraphs have a title: the prayer for rain, the prayer thanking God for waking up in the morning. That will take less than a second to read what the theme of that paragraph is. That makes a difference. So there are a lot of tools. This debate, this tension is more accessible than the fundamental one about having full mental focus and reciting the rote text. But again, at the end of the day, understanding, being able to connect to the text is so important, but to be able to do it in an ideal way, it requires a lot of work. And there's nothing wrong with that. Prayer, our way to connect to God, shouldn't be an easy thing that we do a check mark, that we recite a quick thing like, hey, how you doing? When we say to someone on the street, hi, how you doing? We don't really care how they're doing. We don't really want to hear an answer. But with God, we are in the presence of God, conversing with God. We should care what we're saying, and we should understand what we're saying in the presence of God.